Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the Science Communication webinar brought to you by the new Student Committee of the International Society for Reef Studies, or ISRS. My name is Elena Bulati, and I'm talking to you from Southampton in the UK, where I'm currently finishing my PhD in coral biology. So as this is our first webinar, I would just like to quickly introduce the ISRS Student Committee. And for anybody that is tuning in that comes from a different background or a different discipline, or if you just haven't heard about ISRS, it stands for the International Society for Reef Studies. It has existed since 1980, and it brings together scientists and managers working with coral reefs or other environments connected to coral reefs. So this year, Sandra and Laura, who are two of our committee chairs, had the idea of forming a committee led and run by students with the aim of putting together a series of initiatives that we believe will be useful to other students working with coral reefs. The areas we cover are science communication, social media, outreach and education, and professional development. And if you would like to know more about us, you can find a link to the committee website in the description below the YouTube video. So as part of our professional development agenda, we're organising this webinar series to discuss a range of topics and skills that we think can benefit a student's career in our field. As we're just starting out, we're open to suggestions on any topics you guys would like to see discussed in this space. So if you want to get in contact, please go ahead and either tweet to us at ISRS Reef Student or contact us through the website. So for the first webinar of the series, Ashley is in Melbourne today with our guest speaker. So I'll just hand over to her to do the introductions. Good morning, Ashley.
Good morning. So like Elena said, my name is Ashley Dungan. I am a PhD student at the University of Melbourne, working under Drs. Madeline Van Open and Linda Blackall. Our role as members of the professional development team is to facilitate student learning or exposure in areas where there may be gaps. It's a hard truth that research higher degree students are most often unprepared when it comes to communicating outside of peer review. However, after and even during our research degrees, we have to be able to speak to the press, to legislators, to policymakers, to grant agencies, and the man on the street. So the goal of this webinar is to teach students how to communicate with the general public via blog posting. This webinar is being hosted in conjunction with the startup of our new blog just for Reef Studies students, which can be found at our ISRS Student Committee website, which is linked below the video. So here with me is Dr. Jenny Martin. Jenny is a senior lecturer in science communication at the University of Melbourne, where she founded, designed, and leads the university's highly acclaimed science communication program. In addition to teaching, she is also actively and personally involved in science communication, as she has a radio segment and writes for both a blog and a children's magazine. We are very thankful for Jenny to have joined us so early this morning. Before I turn it over to Jenny, just a reminder, if you have questions, please live tweet them via our handle, ISRS Reef Student. And you can also use the chat box to the right side of the YouTube video if you have any questions. So with that, take it away, Jenny.
Working? Hi, everyone. You need to be muted. Okay, all good? All right, good morning, good afternoon. Wherever you are, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for the invitation to speak with you guys today. And hopefully that has worked, I think. So let me just go like this. So what we're going to talk about today is blogging, and particularly blogging about science. And obviously for you guys, there's a particular area of science that you're going to be blogging about. But I think pretty much everything that I'm going to say applies to any area of science. And I should just point out that my background in blogging actually comes from a blog I run in conjunction with a radio segment that I do every week on Australia's largest community radio station. And so that's a breakfast radio segment. So I actually write about other people's research, not my research. But this applies to whatever sort of science you want to write about. And I thought we'd just start off by talking about why you might want to blog about science. And really my first point up there should say because it's fun, just as much as any of the more serious reasons I'm about to go through. But any of you who are poised with fingertips to keyboards, I think are about to find out just how much fun blogging is. And I'm sure some of you have already done some blogging. But I think one of the main things to bear in mind is that, sadly, not many people are going to read your thesis. You know, we reckon that most theses get read by yourself, maybe your parents, if they're kind, maybe your partner, obviously your supervisors and your examiners. But the fact is that most people don't read theses, and also not that many people read papers. So if your wonderful research is going to be read by a few more people out there, then blogging is a really terrific way to do that. And obviously then you can take advantage of all of the social media we have open to us to be able to tell people about the blog post that you've written. And you can certainly argue, I think, that given that most research these days is publicly funded, you can also argue, in fact, that we have an obligation to make our research findings accessible to the public, given that they're funding it. And things that you write in papers and in theses are just not accessible to the public, either because they just physically don't have access to them, perhaps because your papers are behind a paywall, but more importantly, because they're written in a style that we're trained to write in that's just not accessible to somebody who hasn't had the luxury of the same scientific training that we've had. Obviously, blogging is a terrific way to foster new connections, to forge new collaborations. It's a fantastic way for people who you might never come across otherwise to hear about your research. And that's within academia, but also more broadly as well. One of the things I really love about blogging is writing about science from a different angle and with a different audience in mind, which we'll come to in a second, is a really good way to hone your thinking about your work. So anyone out there who's ever done any teaching, I'm sure can relate to my experience that having to explain something to a student is a really good way to work out if I understand it or not myself. And I think blogging is the same thing, because you're explaining something to somebody who's very new to this particular area, you suddenly have to really question your own understanding and explain things much better than you would otherwise. Similarly, you'll find that blogging massively improves your writing skills, because blogging requires a particular sort of writing style that we're going to focus on for most of this webinar that has to be very clear and very concise. And that's got to be a good thing, learning to write more clearly and more concisely. So committing to writing a blog is an excellent way to improve your skills, which will have flow-on effects to writing your thesis and writing your papers and anything else you ever need to write, like grant applications, which is a very important skill. I find committing to writing, so I write my blog every week, no matter how busy I am, no matter how many commitments I have, no matter how late in the night or early in the morning, it means I'm writing. And I find that just having to write to a schedule is a terrific cure for procrastination, because often other things that we're writing, you know, you can kind of just get it done when you get it done, whereas absolutely having to have something and hit publish on it to a schedule is a very good way to write more often and to write more effectively. And I think you would all be aware of just how important it is today to have an online presence that isn't just sharing photos of yourself on the weekend on, you know, on Facebook, but also having a professional presence. And writing a blog is a very effective way to do that. There's been lots of research with mixed results in terms of whether blogging increases citations of your work, but there's certainly good evidence that blogging about your research is a very good way for it to be more widely known and more widely understood, and that in some circumstances that definitely leads to increased citations. But if you've never heard of altmetrics, I'd like to introduce you to the idea that blogging is important, not in terms necessarily of traditional citations, but you'd all be aware of this idea of academic impact. So the journals we publish in count, how often our papers get cited, the number of papers we publish, our H-index, all of these things matter. And as much as people argue about the validity of these measures, the fact is they're going to matter for a long time. But the area we're moving to now, and probably more so in some of the countries you're in than in Australia, although Australia is now coming to this party, is the idea that we also want to measure the impact our research has on society. So these are alternative metrics or alt metrics. And this is now becoming quite big and important business. So when your research is mentioned in the news or in social media or in policy, this all counts. And I think there's very strong agreement now that yes, academic impact matters, but societal impact matters too. And this is a really good reason, if none of the others have convinced you, this is a really good reason why you should be blogging about your research. And I think there's this general feeling people often have that scientists and the public are incredibly different. Never the twain shall meet. What we're interested in is not something that the public's interested in, but I just don't buy that at all. We don't have time to go into it, but there's lots of research to show how interested the public is in science. And to say that it's apples and oranges, I just don't agree with. I think there's very clear evidence that things that we do are of interest to the public, and we just need to learn how to communicate better so that the public can understand what it is that we're doing and why it might be relevant and interesting to them. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, yeah, sure, but the research I do isn't interesting to the public, I would challenge you on that, because I don't think that's true. I think all science can be made interesting. And this is me paraphrasing H.G. Wells, but I think it's really good to bear in mind. So this is how we need to write. We don't need to dumb it down, but we also shouldn't assume that our writing is required reading, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the main thing is just to realise that even though your readers might not have had the same science training as you have, it doesn't mean they're not funny, articulate and intelligent. And this is another quote which I like. Tim Radford's a well-known Guardian columnist. And I think if we all remember this, it would serve us well. So we shouldn't overestimate our readers' knowledge, but we shouldn't underestimate their intelligence. So obviously in the first instance, you might be thinking for your new blog, which is really exciting that you're launching this blog, that you're basically writing for each other. So in fact, you are writing for other people with the same science training as you are. But with time, you guys are going to build this amazing readership because your blog's going to be such a fantastic place full of interesting writing. And so you do need to make sure you're aiming to be writing for people who don't have your training. And they're just as smart as you are, or as we are, us being the scientists, but they just haven't had our training. And I think it's a really important thing for us to remember. A lot of what we write for what people call a captive reader. So that means somebody has to read it. So your supervisor has to read your thesis. Now, you should still make it as good and as readable as you can, but the point is they have to read it. When it comes to blogging, you're writing for what we call a wild audience, a wild reader. What that means is you're writing for somebody who doesn't have to read what you've written. So you always have to have in your mind when you're writing that nobody's got to read this. Nobody is obliged to read it. So if you want them to read it, which of course you should want them to read it, you've got to make sure you make it as engaging and readable as possible. So always bear that in mind. You are writing not for a captive audience, and that's exactly what H.G. Wells was trying to say. This isn't required reading for anybody. We all have to recognise that we've been taught to write like scientists. And that's great. That's what we need to do for our discipline. You need to write papers, you need to write theses. So these are some of the ways that scientific writing is described. And I'm sure you would recognise in that the way you've been taught to write. But the problem is when we show scientific writing to, I'll call them the general public. We can argue for years about what that actually means, but essentially we're talking about a non-scientifically trained audience. And if you ask them what they think scientific writing looks like and reads like and sounds like, they say words like this. And I didn't make them up, I actually asked people. So impenetrable, stodgy, long, boring, impersonal, pompous, technical, elitist, and torturous. They came straight from the mouths of people I know. So if you write a blog that's like that, nobody is going to read it. And they don't have to read it, remember. So the key thing is to write in a way that's not like that. So it's a very different approach, and you've got to know your audience. So anyone who's ever studied any science communication would know the kind of golden foundational rule of science communication is know your audience. So you guys need to think very clearly about who this general audience is that you're writing for. Who would you like to be reading about your research? Who are you going to advertise your blog posts to? Is it going to be your friends, your family? Is it going to be community groups? Is it going to be lobby groups? Is it going to be politicians? Is it going to be, who is it going to be? Think about who they are. And then think about how you might write for them. Work out what your main message. So for any of you individuals sitting down, ready to write a blog post, and this is something that doesn't take hours and weeks and months like a paper. A blog post, you're probably aiming for around 600 to 700 words. That's a good length for an online piece of writing. So, if it's something that you know well, it's a couple of hours of work. But the key thing is to make sure you know what your main message is. And then to make sure that message can be related to your readers' interests. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be specifically about some application that's going to change their life, but it has to be something you can get them interested in. So that's my task every Wednesday. I've been doing it for 4 years now. I think every Wednesday I have to come up with a topic that I think I can get a breakfast radio audience interested in. So there's hundreds and hundreds of things out there, and I guarantee you that there are aspects of your research that can be made interesting to people, but you have to think about it. Why should they care? Why should they read this? And, test it out on people. Talk to your family, talk to your friends. Pitch an idea to them. I was thinking of writing a blog post about this. What would you find interesting about that? Test your ideas. How or why is it relevant to them? And then really importantly, what can you leave out? Because as scientists, we tend to do lots of things or write about lots of things that aren't going to be of interest to a general audience. And often that's your methods. We care a lot about methods because it's how we judge whether the science has been done properly. And in some cases, your research the methods may be very important. It may be the focus of your research. You may be doing something new and exciting. But in general, a non-scientifically trained audience just wants to know what you found out and what it means. They don't really care how you found it out. So think carefully about what you don't talk about. And remember, if you're only writing 6 or 7 or maybe 800 words, you don't have that many words to play with. And I think the best way to get a feel for this new and different style of writing is to go and read a whole lot of what gets called popular science. So go and find some other blogs that you think are well written, that you find engaging and interesting, and then see what, work it out, do some analysis. Why was it good? So some of my favourite writers are Carl Zimmer and Ed Yong, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. We're going to talk about Carl Zimmer again in a minute. And I often, if I've got 5 minutes, instead of scrolling Facebook and wasting that 5 minutes, I'll just quickly switch and see the latest thing that these guys have written to just, constantly remind myself what good science writing is in this popular space. So blog writing, you have to balance these two things. It's really important to remember that on the one hand, you're sharing your passion, you're sharing something that you love, that you're excited about, that you've decided your audience could be interested in, and you're trying to write about it in a fairly conversational way, which we'll come back to in a second. But you've got to remember that you're writing a science blog, which means it has to be evidence-based. So you're not just ranting about something, you're not just making stuff up as you go along, you are actually writing something that's evidence-based. And that's what separates a science blog, and particularly a research blog, from other blogs. So always remember that. Blog writing really needs to have images, and we're going to talk later about how you find appropriate images. So that's one of the other defining features of blog writing is images. Telling a story, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that it's all about a narrative which will be engaging. If you don't know what I mean by that, then definitely have a look at some of the good blogs that are out there, and I can certainly give you a list of a whole lot of blogs to look at if you'd like that. There's an interesting headline, so use yourself as a test case. When you're scrolling through things on your phone or online, what is it that grabs your attention? What would you bother to click on and to read further? The thing that you all need to remember is if you want to build an audience on your new blog, you need to have regular posts. So each of you who's going to commit to writing, that doesn't mean you write something once a year, because a static page, so a page that's never or only rarely updated, won't generate an audience. But the great thing about blog writing is that you get to be both a scientist and a person who has interests, who has values, who has ideas. The best blogs out there bring something personal to them. So it's not just about the science, it's about being a person too. And it means you can talk about new ideas. I said it has to be evidence-based, but that doesn't mean you can't speculate. That doesn't mean you can't write about things that aren't ready for a scientific paper yet. You know, you don't just regurgitate stuff that's been said before, in many other places. This is a chance to think creatively and to think in new ways about your research, which is really exciting. And I just encourage you to come back to thinking about what contribution you can make. We've all heard the internet has been likened to a constant flow of water gushing out of a fire hydrant, and it's just impossible to know what to read, what to leave, what's good value, what's not. And your job is to think about what positive and useful contribution you can make to this constant stream of water. And I think that's a really exciting thing to do, to work out what it is that you would contribute. So I nicked these from the internet, but the idea is we've been trained to write like this. So you've got to think very carefully about this academic writing style, where we start with a lot of general introduction, we slowly build our arguments, and the main point is to build to this big conclusion. And any of you who've studied communication will know that what you're trying to do in popular writing is what's called the inverted pyramid, where you turn it upside down and you start with your most important information. So you give away the punchline, often in the headline, if not in the headline, in the very beginning. So this is the start of you thinking about this different style of writing, and I like this version of it. If somebody's going to quickly skim read and only look very briefly at what you've written and only potentially read the first paragraph, whatever your main message is, we talked about having a main message, you've got to make sure that's not buried away at the end, the way we often do with other types of scientific writing. Make sure it's right at the start. So a few other general points about blog writing style. Subheadings are a really good strategy with blog writing. The reason why is because think about yourself and how you tend to read online material. It's very different to reading stuff on paper. You're often reading on quite a small screen, and you're also often just skimming and being distracted by other notifications and other things going on. What subheadings do is break up your writing into really short sections, and you're therefore making it easy for somebody to skim read and somebody to enter your text at multiple different points. So they might read your heading, they might read the first sentence, then they might scroll down a bit. And having a couple of subheadings to encourage them to be aware of what you're writing about, it makes a really big difference. Now, normal writing that we're all used to doing might have, paragraphs that are 8, 9, 10 sentences long. In a blog, a paragraph might only be 1 sentence long, and probably at the maximum, it's only 4 sentences. Different, short, sharp style of writing. And it's all about people reading on screens. But the other thing, as I said, is that it's very important that you include links to reputable sources. So there's 2 ways to include links. One is to hyperlink within the text, which I'm sure you've all seen and you've probably done. So whenever you're writing something that doesn't just come out of your head and in fact is based on a piece of research, whether it's yours or somebody else's, you should hyperlink to that so that people can click on that link and see where you got it from. Now, often in science, you can only link to an abstract because the rest of it is behind a paywall, but that's okay. It's generally accepted that as long as you can show the abstract, that's fine. What you might also want to do, though, is at the end of your blog post, you might want to provide a couple of general references so that somebody who's interested in the topic that you're writing about, rather than them just going to Google and starting from scratch, you can kind of curate a list of a couple of other sources that might be good for them. But of course, I've said reputable sources, and that's really important for you to decide what sources you trust. So I know the sort of sources I'm happy to link people to, but you need to decide yourself what you think is reputable, what you're happy to recommend. So I said I'd talk about Carl Zimmer, who, as I said, is a fantastic blogger, and he's written quite a bit about how to do good science writing. And these are the things that he talks about. So I just want to briefly go through some points about the words you might choose, the sentences you might choose, how you write your paragraphs, how you might tell a story. I've added title to his list because I think titles are really important. And if you've never read any of Carl Zimmer's stuff, he's got a website. He also has a great blog called The Loom. Really good place to start on popular science writing. So these are the things that I want to talk about when it comes to words. So 6 different things that I want you to bear in mind when you're choosing the words to use in your blog post. So jargon obviously is one of the major issues that people have about science writing. And so I said Ed Yong is another great science blogger who I love. And this is kind of paraphrased from Einstein. So you educate people by explaining complex ideas in a simple way, not by explaining simple ideas in a complex way. So we have to get over this idea that our science is too complicated to be explained to your average layperson, your average man on the street, as Ashley said, because it's not. It's just lazy if we say we can't do it. But the problem is that we've all developed a shorthand language to be able to talk to each other without all the extra explanations, and that's called jargon. And there's nothing wrong with jargon if it's used in the right context. So if you're talking to somebody else in your field, it's absolutely right that you should use technical language that you both agree on. But the problem comes when we assume that other people understand that technical language, because if they haven't had our training, they don't. And the reality is that as you become more and more focused in your training, you know, by the time you're at a PhD, you can't understand the jargon of most other scientists not in your field, and they can't understand yours either. So when I have a class of 140 research active science students, all from different disciplines, and I get them to talk to each other for 30 seconds about what their research is, if I don't get them to think particularly about jargon, hardly any of them can understand each other, even though they're all scientists. So these are some of the words that got picked up by my students as being jargon in each other's speaking. And some of these might be absolutely normal to you, but others, it depends on the field of science. And remember, you're trying to write for people who've never had any science training. But I thought you'd be particularly interested that to a physicist, the term marine environment is jargon, which kind of seems weird. Like, I'm a biologist as well. You know, how could that be jargon? But the point is, to somebody who's never studied biology, it actually is. And so you need to think about someone who's never even studied science, what some of the language you might use and how it would be considered jargon. So we've got to think very carefully about the words we choose. The next thing to say is that we all tend to get pretty lazy with the verbs that we use. So think back to your earliest schooling. Verbs are doing words. And we tend to get pretty lazy and just use things like make, find, get, have. We use to be all the time. But there's a whole lot of interesting verbs out there. And if you Google strong verbs, you will find list upon list of verbs that you might have forgotten all about that can add so much life and colour to your writing. So, you know, as an example, why say that the seal ate the fish if you can say that the seal devoured the fish? So think about the words that you can use. And these are probably the sort of verbs that you've trained yourself out of using because they don't belong in formal scientific writing. So now you have to train yourself back into thinking like a younger student and thinking about interesting ways to say things. The next thing is the idea that we've got to get rid of some of the adverbs that we use. So there's nothing wrong with saying she walked unsteadily down the corridor, where unsteadily is the adverb describing the verb. But you could also just say that she staggered down the corridor. Similarly, he shut the door loudly. Well, why not he slammed the door? Now, obviously, these aren't science examples. But when you write, just always think, could I say this in a more interesting way? And adverbs are a really good thing to check. You may not have heard of nominalizations before, but it's a key way that scientists tend to write, and that is we turn verbs into nouns because somehow we've learned along the way that it sounds more formal or that it sounds more official or it just sounds more kind of sciencey. The way you find a nominalization is where you find a noun that has some of these suffixes, so some of these endings. And the key is to get rid of them as nouns and turn them back into verbs, turn them back into action words that make your writing more interesting. So rather than talking about selections and activations and expressions and recognitions, we can just use the verb to select, to activate, to produce. So go through and check whether your habit is to turn these verbs into nouns. Similarly, we tend to write in particular constructions that just makes things more wordy. Again, maybe it sounds more formal, but much better to go back to the basics. So why, is dubious about or is doubtful of, when you can just say that somebody doubts. So always try and pare back as many words as you can to the basics of what you're trying to say. So when I said before that it's only a few hours work to write a blog post, it depends how much retraining you need to do in your writing. So I can write a blog post in a few hours now, but certainly when I started, the editing process was quite long and involved to make my writing as readable and as engaging as I could. I don't know if anyone's like me and tends to use the word that all the time, but that is one of the things that I used to do a lot of. Things like there are a number of studies that show that this is a bad idea because of the fact that, and all of a sudden we've got too many that's. So it's really a very useful idea to search for words like that, but also very, really, quite basically a whole lot of adverbs. So any words that you tend to overuse, it's a very good idea to search for them and get rid of them. And particularly these adverbs, do they actually add anything to what you're saying? Probably not. And Mark Twain has a great quote, "Substitute damn every time you're inclined to write very. Your editor will delete it and the writing will be just as it should be." So we've got to be aware of our writing habits. Now, I said I wanted to talk briefly about headlines. And the reason headlines are so important is because really you just have such a small amount of time to get somebody's attention. So you've got to make it irresistible. It's got to be something that people see and think, oh, fantastic, I really want to read that. But of course you can't be misleading. Your headline also does have to tell people what your blog post is going to be about. So it's this balance between something catching but something that's informative. And remember, you're also trying to provide information that's going to help searchers actually find your writing. So you've got to think about keywords. Headlines are really hard. So sometimes it can take me longer to come up with a good headline for my post than it can take to write half of it. And often I feel like I don't succeed. I've committed to a deadline, I have to hit publish, and sometimes I have headlines that I just don't like very much at all, but you've got to try your best. So it's getting this balance between being correct, being factual, but also standing out from the crowd. And this is where, it can be really fun. There can be a bit of room for something a bit enigmatic, something a bit unusual, something that will catch people's eye. So I went through Scientific American and pulled out some of the titles they've used in recent years that I really like. But I think some of these are great. I mean, I'd love to know what hyena giggles really say. I'd love to know more about hyena communication. You can see that they're trying to write something interesting, something a little bit puzzling, something fairly classic. And these are obviously all serious scientific posts. They're all from Scientific American. So think about your titles, think about what can make your work stand out. So I won't go into a lot of detail about sentences and paragraphs, but suffice to say, our tendency is to write long sentences. So it's really important that you work out if you can split your sentences up and make them much shorter and simpler. And similarly, remember I said a paragraph, it should be shorter than 4 sentences. Now, there's no absolute golden rule. It may be that a paragraph that's longer works, but as a general rule, you're trying to keep it short. And the thing about a paragraph is it has to be just about one idea. And as soon as you're talking about a different idea, you need to start another paragraph. So there's lots of good writing advice online, and I highly recommend that you read some of it. But just you're going back to basics, short sentences, short paragraphs. And I definitely recommend getting rid of the extra adverbs, like we said. And whenever you can use a simple word rather than a complex word, then do it. So my classic hate word is utilise. I just don't see why anyone ever needs to use the word utilise when use is just as good. So think about the long words you started training yourself to use, which may have a place in a paper or a thesis. It depends on the style you're going for, but I don't think it has any place in scientific writing, in blog writing. We tend to use a lot of redundancies. People talk about things being very unique. Well, it's either unique or it's not. 5 a.m. in the morning, cut back, go through and search for how often you use small prepositions like to and for and in and of, and get rid of them where you can. Search for that, there is, there are, a whole lot of things we add to our writing. And if we had more time, I would give you list upon list of things we use that you just don't need to use. When you're editing, I would also recommend, if you can justify the paper, printing it out and circling the punctuation that you have used. So actually with a pen, circling the punctuation, because punctuation is very important in blog writing, because you're trying to write in a conversational way. You're trying to sound just like you're chatting to somebody, in a cafe or over a meal. And punctuation really helps with that. So it's important that you get your punctuation right. So if you're somebody who never uses commas, you might need to add a few. If you're someone who uses commas far too often, you're going to need to take a few out. But think carefully about your punctuation. But just as a general rule, when you're editing, the aim is to cut things out. So we talk about search and destroying. So getting rid of everything that doesn't need to be there. So it is simple and a real pleasure to read. But think about last time you read something that you didn't pause, you didn't get caught up on a poorly written sentence, you didn't, get confused what they were talking about. You just read it straight through and found that a really enjoyable and interesting experience. You're trying to aim to have your writing be just like that. Briefly, a writer called Helen Sword, who's got a great book called Stylish Academic Writing. I think she's from New Zealand, and she just has a few points. She calls them her 7 secrets of stylish academic writing. So obviously she's talking about title, and she's got some suggestions, a statement, a metaphor. But I really like her summary, and that is that your title needs to be an advertisement, not a synopsis. So you're not trying to tell everything, you're trying to advertise what your main message is and what's going to be exciting. Next, she talks about your opening hook. So if you've ever studied communication, you might be aware of this idea of a hook. And that's this analogy that, if you're out there fishing with nothing on the end of your line, the fish are just going to go straight on past. But if there's something on the end of the line, the fish are going to bite. And so you need to have a hook on the end of your line in your little opening sentences that's going to capture people's attention. So generally you have your title, and then under that you might have a couple of sentences that just really capture people's attention. So, it can be some anecdote, it can be a quote, it can be some amazing statistic, something very catching to indicate what's to come. Obviously, we've talked about telling stories, and that's a massive topic that I could talk about for hours, but I think most people have a general sense of what it means. A story has to have a setting, it has to have characters, and they don't have to be human characters. They can be any number of different things. But, last time you read a good book that you couldn't put down, it's because you wanted to find out what happened next. And that's what you want to do with your blog post too. You want to tell a story that keeps people reading. I've said this many times, you've got to sound like a person. So none of this formal, long-winded, pompous, dodgy, whatever those other words were. It's got to be conversational and chatty. And the best way to find that out is to read your writing aloud and make sure it sounds like it would be something that you would be comfortable saying out loud to a friend. Be concrete. Again, we could talk about this for ages, but the problem is that as scientists, we often tend to write in quite abstract terms, and that doesn't work for a blog post. So be specific and be clear. What is it that you're talking about? What is it that matters here? We've talked about verbs, and Helen agrees. Verbs are the best way to make your writing more interesting. And then really it's all about detail. It's hard and it's time-consuming to write good blog writing, good popular writing. And the time it takes is largely about eliminating all of the stuff that doesn't need to be there and to polishing your writing. So that's what you have to allow time for. So that first draft, like anything, is just a first draft that you're going to need to come back to. All right, there's 2 more little things I want to talk about. One is how you're going to find appropriate images to use for your blog posts, because I would never recommend publishing a blog post that doesn't have some images with it. The safest thing to do is to use your own images, because then you know that there's no copyright associated with them. You need to make that clear in the caption. You know, you need to say author's image, or, you know, however you want to phrase that. But if you want to find other images, then there's lots of places you can find images that are licensed under what we call Creative Commons. So Flickr, Pixabay, Unsplash, there's lots of different places that you can look. The main thing to know is that you cannot just go onto Google Images and search for an image and take whatever you like. Pretty much all images that come up on Google searches are under copyright, and you and the administrators of your blog will be in breach of copyright if you put them up. Unless on Google you filter by usage rights. And that's the same on Flickr. So you can't just take anything you find on Flickr. You have to toggle the usage rights and say that you want Creative Commons images. It's very important. And then when you credit your image, you have to say whose the photo is and where you got it from. So for example, if you took it from Flickr, you would say via Flickr, and then you would hyperlink to the page where you got it from. So not just the Flickr homepage, but the actual page where you got that image from, so people can see the correct crediting information. And a shameless plug, not because I'm desperate for you all to go and read my blog, but just because you can see how to set up the image credits, how I've done it there. One other note which I haven't written down, and that is that obviously in many cases you're going to be writing about your own research. Think very carefully about using a figure or a table that you have prepared for a scientific audience. So if you're writing a popular version of your latest paper or your latest conference talk, think very carefully about whether those figures are appropriate for a non-scientific audience, because 99% of the time it's not. It will be too complicated, it will have too many extra bits, you know, layers of information on it. I'm not saying you can't use figures, of course you can. My blog is not that sort of blog, but many research blogs have many figures in them. But you probably need to recreate a figure that is going to be quite different and quite simplified. The last thing I'd like to point out is just that it's very important you check how readable your writing is. So the best way to do this without question is to read your writing aloud. If you don't feel comfortable reading it aloud, then it's probably not readable enough for a general audience, and you're going to have to make the sentences shorter, take out the long words. But there's some online tools that can help you. So Helen Sword, who I just mentioned, has got a great online test, which I won't take you through now, but it's very easy to use. If you just Google the Writer's Diet Test, you can plug in anywhere from 100 to 1,000 words, and the test will analyse it for you, and it will give you an analysis that shows you anything from, you know, if you're using too many adverbs, if you're using the verb to be too often, it will go through and highlight parts of the text for you. And it's called the Writer's Diet because it'll come out and tell you whether your writing is in heart attack territory, whether it's just a bit flabby, or whether it's fit and trim. And this is where I worked out how often I use the word that. So Helen Sword taught me to get rid of that. Now, bear in mind that it's not calibrated for science writing, so it doesn't mean you always have to get down in the fit and trim range. It may be that you just have quite a lot of nouns in it that she will pick up that is fine for your science writing. So this isn't gospel, but it's a really good way to learn more about your writing. You can also just get a readability score, and the most common one is the Flesch Reading Ease score. If you go to this site, Readable, again, plug in your writing. It will give you a number of how readable it is based on the number of syllables in the words, the length of the sentences, the amount of jargon, all of these things. And we're told for a blog we should aim for a score of 70 to 80, which is what an average adult reads at, which is actually a low high school reading level, but that's what you should be aiming for. So again, don't take any of these as absolute truth, but just learn about your writing style by using them. And in fact, in Microsoft Word, within the spelling and grammar checker, you can also just look at the readability statistics there. So this is the last slide, just a few pitfalls that I want you to be aware of. Think carefully about what's interesting and what might be interesting to your audience. And as scientists, we tend to often confuse important with interesting. We think because something is scientifically important that automatically makes it interesting, and I don't think that's true. We've talked about having an engaging title and a hook, but, you know, don't go for clickbait. Don't use some cheap gag. Make sure it's accurate. Make sure there's real information there that will interest people, because the problem with clickbait is you click on it thinking you're getting one thing and you end up getting something quite different, and you soon navigate away from the page. You're likely in the first instance just to write too much. Too many words, too many sentences, too many paragraphs, sentences that are too long, too much jargon. So enjoy this process of learning how to pare back your writing to basics, and to make it interesting writing. I don't need to say this again. Obviously, the tone you write in matters enormously, or people aren't going to read. Thinking carefully about your audience, who you're writing for. A lot of writers say they pick one person to have in their mind that they're writing for. You know, maybe it's their grandma or the intelligent person down the street who's never studied science. You know, a really bright kid. Think about who you're writing for. And the worst thing is when we condescend to our audience. So when we forget what H.G. Wells said, you know, and we treat our audience as lacking in intelligence rather than just lacking in science training. So again, I'd encourage you to share your drafts of your writing with other people and see how they feel, see what they think. And my last point is that as scientists, we tend to, we know a lot about our research areas. We know how exciting it is. We know that everything's interconnected. We know there's this huge story there, and we want to try and tell it. And you just can't. You know, in 600 or 700 words, you can't tell the whole story. You can't cover all the bases. You can't go down all the different tangents. So pick a small story, something that you can do justice to and tell it well. And if you've got another story or 10 stories to tell, then just write more blog posts. I'm sure the students who are getting this blog together will be very happy to have you writing regularly. And I've talked for a long time. Ashley, I think that's all we need to say. Do we have any questions that we want to answer?
We do actually have a couple questions. So I have some, and Elena has one as well.
Shall I get rid of this? Let's have a look. So I can get rid of that. No, I'll get rid of that.
I think Elena can control and there we go. So the first question I have, we talked a lot about jargon, and you know, I think it's very interesting that another scientist pointed out that marine environment can be jargon for them. So I'm interested, how do you decide if something is jargon, and maybe what strategies might you recommend for early blog writers to sort of remove and replace some of these terms?
I think it's a really good question, because jargon is only jargon for the wrong audience. And when you don't know exactly who's reading and you know, you can't predict which audience you're trying to bring in, you can't necessarily be sure. So the best thing to do is to be overcautious and to minimize anything that could be considered jargon. And the best way to find it is just to ask people who don't have science training. So that there are online tools. I can, you know, if we want to send out some resources to everybody after this, I can give you a tool. There's an app called the De-Jargonizer, which will look at your writing and pick up every word that's not in the most, I don't know, you know, 800 most common words or 10,000 most common words, whatever it is. So it will highlight words for you. So there's tools you can use. But what I get my students to do is I always run a Facebook group for my classes. And when they're writing anything that has to be understood by each other, I get them to put on the Facebook group, do you understand these words? And they'll list all the words they're planning on using, and using the student group to respond to them. So I've got no idea what that means. Oh, yeah, that's fine. And if you get enough people from enough different disciplines, you know, you can do that. But that's for writing for other scientists. If you're trying to write for a non-scientifically trained audience, I would just ask people. You know, ask your mum, ask your dad, ask your partner, ask your friend, ask somebody that you play sport with. You know, just find people who don't have your training and ask them what they think. But yeah, there's no golden rule, because what's jargon to you might not be jargon to me, might be jargon to someone down the street. But conservative is the way to go. So I've got a friend who used to write for a newspaper here in Melbourne, which is the most widely read newspaper in Australia. And she was told she couldn't use the word sell because sell was jargon for an average adult audience. So it's hard, right?
All right, Elena, do you have a question?
I also have a jargon question for a more specific coral reef students jargon question. So there's a few words that I always really struggle to find a way to say without saying the word. And I was wondering whether you could help me find a good substitute. So I always struggle to find another way to say algae, because tiny plants sounds really weird.
I mean, I think this I think is where it comes down to remembering that your audience is highly intelligent generally. So you can use the word algae, but the first time you use it, just explain what it is. You know, that's the other way of getting around it, is not to never use a term that might be considered jargon, but the very first time you use it, to add an additional sentence, which, you know, might be kind of a humorous sentence along the lines of these tiny plants that, you know, most people don't really understand what they are, or I don't know. I think you can get around it by, so don't feel like you can never use the word algae, but, you know, what I think of as algae might be totally different to what you think of as algae, might be totally different to what the next person thinks of as algae. So you just need to be very clear on what it is that you mean. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know any other way to say it other than test it out on people that you know. You know, if I was to use the word algae, what would you think it meant? If I was to say tiny plants, what would you think I'm meaning? Because, you know, when I think tiny plants, I don't think algae. I think, you know, little tomato seedlings that are that are going to grow in the garden. So, yeah, I mean, this is the fun of it. You know, I've talked about lots of serious stuff, but at the end of the day, the reason you blog and the reason a lot of us spend a lot of time blogging is just because it's really fun. You know, working out how to explain algae to somebody who's never studied it is actually really quite enjoyable. Working out how to get people to see the excitement of algae is really cool.
And I've got another one. Do you use infographics in your blog, and do you think it's a good way to get to people?
Yeah, definitely. I must admit, I don't use them often, only because I've never put in the time to work out how to make them. And I've never been good at finding ones that are, you know, Creative Commons licensed. But yes, I think infographics is a great thing to do. And in particular, if you are planning on using, you know, a figure or a table that you prepared elsewhere and you realise that it's not very well suited, then investing a little bit of time into making an infographic is a great idea for a blog. And of course, you may find you can use it in a conference talk later, because so many conferences these days are very interdisciplinary. We have to be really careful about how we present our data in conferences as well. So, yes, and I know there's lots of online tools to use to make good infographics. I've just never learned to use any of them yet. So you guys can teach me. Can you run a webinar on how to make good infographics once you've worked out how to do it?
Got somebody in mind for that.
Perfect. Excellent.
We just have a couple minutes left, so I'll ask maybe one more question. I think of the questions that have addressed most of it, but something that I struggle with is, you know, I understand how important science communication is, and, you know, I'm really interested in communicating with policymakers and legislators, and it's really a great way to start that transition into science communication. Mm-hmm. But man, I'm busy, and you know, research higher degree students, we are busy all the time. So is there any just sort of like how to get started, maybe how to get over that barrier of, I know this is really important, but I'm so busy, you know, maybe just some advice in that front.
Yeah, I totally get it, because, yeah, I'm ridiculously busy too, and it would be very easy for me each week to say, actually, you know, I just can't do it. You know, my blog, the only person I answer to is myself. I decide each week if I'm going to write, and, you know, I don't have to write a blog post tomorrow morning, but, you know, somehow I'm going to do it. So I think there's a couple of things. One is to work out why it's a priority for you. What are the benefits to you of doing it? And be quite concrete about that, you know, rather than just, oh, I think it would be a good thing for me to do. Actually think about the career goals that you've got. I mean, one of the things I do a lot of teaching about now is the fact that, you know, very few research students are actually going to end up in research jobs. There's hardly any academic jobs out there. So in Australia, the figures are something like less than 10% of people currently undertaking research higher degrees will end up in research jobs. Not because they're not brilliant, it's just because there aren't any jobs there. So you need to start building your broader skill set right now so that you're employable, because it's not like you're not going to get a job. There's thousands of jobs out there for people with science training. but they're jobs outside of universities, outside of research institutions, and starting to build your skill set of things like being able to write for different audiences is crucial that you do it now, not after you finish your PhD and you're suddenly desperate for a job. You know, if you can start writing blog posts now, if you're on your CV, you can say blogger for the last year or 2 years or whatever, and here are some URLs, here's some of the stuff that I've written. You know, I get graduate recruiters in here all the time and they say, it counts, it really counts. They want to see that. So be clear on why it's of benefit to you. And then I just think you have to carve out time. You have to say, well, every Thursday afternoon between 2 and 5, this is what I do. And you actually prioritize it and put it in your diary and just make it happen. And you know, if it's constantly on your to-do list and you never get there and months pass and you're starting to feel really bad about it, I think you've got to question, well, do you actually want to do it? Because it may be that you don't, and that's fine. I'm not saying everybody has to blog. You know, maybe if after 4 months you still haven't managed to write a single thing, maybe that's a sign that it's not something you really want to do, and you should take it back off your to-do list and stop feeling guilty about it. But I think you've got to at least have a go, because you'll probably find that it's quite fun, and you'll probably find it brings many benefits to the other parts of your current life, i.e. writing a thesis, giving talks, teaching, you know, anything else you might be doing, learning to write quickly, learning to write clearly, learning to write concisely, learning to get your ideas straight and logical. You know, those are skills that work everywhere. So, yeah, but it's hard. I totally get it. It's hard to find the time. Just find a way to start and see what the benefits might be.
Yeah, that's definitely good advice. Trying to allocate that time and know that that's what I'm doing.
Well, and committing to a schedule. So I go on air at 7:45 every Wednesday morning. The deal I've made with myself is that my blog post goes live at 7 a.m. so that on air I can say, and if you want to find out more, here it is. So I allow myself a little bit of time to make sure. So, you know, I just have to hit publish by 7 a.m. every Wednesday morning. And often that means I'm writing it at, you know, 4 and 5 a.m. on Wednesday or midnight on Tuesday. But once a week, I'm just happy to do that, because that's a commitment that I've made, because I've seen the benefits. I've seen how much my writing has improved in the years I've been doing it. And you get so much more efficient at it. And yeah, for me, it's kind of, you know, this public obligation. I feel obliged to take advantage of this luxury I've had of all these years of education and make a whole lot of science, which I think is of interest to other people, but is completely inaccessible to other people because it's in scientific journals. I think that's part of my job, to write it in a way that other people can read about it. So I feel quite morally strong that that's something I need to do.
It's really great advice.
Good luck.
Thank you again for joining us. Elena, that's all the questions I have on my end. Did you have anything else?
I've got one more question about promoting a science blog. What do you think, how do you promote your blog, and what do you think are the best ways to promote a student-led blog?
Yeah, I think your first readers will always be your friends and family. So anytime any of you write something, make sure you send an email to everybody you know saying, look what I just wrote, you know, and get them to share it. Obviously, social media makes a massive difference now. So you know, if you're on Instagram, then put a photo of something up there and tell people about your blog. Obviously, Twitter is a major way of doing it. I'm sure you guys have a Facebook page, or you're planning on having a Facebook page. That's a really good way of promoting. But the problem with Facebook, of course, is that it costs money now to promote posts to get many people to see them, but that's another conversation. But really, just by telling people, and I guess being aware that it does take time to build an audience. I think you don't automatically have thousands of people reading things, but it can be really good on Twitter if you can send your link and ping in other people who might be interested in what you're doing, who have a larger following than you. And then if they retweet it, even if only a small proportion of their followers you know, look at what you've done, because there's people with so many followers out there, you can pick it up really well. So I had a blog post the other day, which my own readers, probably, I don't know, I can't remember how many hundreds of people read it, not that many, but then it got picked up by a group here in Australia called CSIRO Publishing, and they promoted it without me asking them to. They just saw it and promoted it, and all of a sudden, you know, there was a couple of thousand people reading this blog post. So slow and steady. It takes time to build an audience. The first people who are going to read it will be people who know you personally and are interested in what you're doing. And, you know, just think about all the people in your life who say, so what do you do? When you tell them, they kind of, they glaze over because it's too technical. Now suddenly you've got a way of telling them in everyday language what it is that you're doing. But yeah, use social media to your advantage is definitely the way to do it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. And I just have one last thing before we close for our viewers. So a few of us from the committee will be at the European Coral Reef Symposium next week in Oxford. And we've organised an informal gathering on Tuesday evening, which is the night before the conference starts. So if anybody fancies joining us for a drink and meeting some fellow reef students, please come along to the Royal Oak in Oxford at 7 p.m. and you can find the address and all of the information on the website. And we will also have a stand for people to stop by, and we will be wearing these beautiful badges. So please feel free to come and talk to us about our blog or any of our other initiatives. And thank you everybody for joining us, and see you soon.